Hi, my name is Marco Wise, and I'm a member of the University IT Communications team. And a project that's been keeping us quite busy this year is HealthCheck. Now, HealthCheck is part of Stanford's effort to keep teaching, healthcare, and research mission going, while keeping everyone as safe as possible. To that end, we built a website, which you see here, that will ask you several questions about symptoms, exposure, tests, travel, and so on. And depending on your answers, we'll tell you whether you're allowed to come on campus, or tell you that you need to quarantine at home for a little while. Now, these decisions are made through a set of rules based on medical information from health professionals at Stanford and the counties around the Bay Area. And they've gotten more complex over time. Now, at first, my process was simple. I would interview the subject matter experts, write down the rules, and then code them. And I would then pass them on to QA for validation. Now, we have a great QA team, but I couldn't help but wonder, am I missing something? Am I missing a scenario that remains unhandled? Did I ask all the right questions of my stakeholders? So I decided to dust off a tool I used when I was teaching logic. It's called a truth table. So what is a truth table? Well, the best way to understand truth tables is to actually build one. And it starts by looking at the rules you're trying to encode. Here's the most recent set of rules regarding travel and quarantine built into HealthCheck. The travel rules state that if you return from travel before November 30th, you need to quarantine for 14 days. And this rule does not apply to healthcare workers or first responders. It also doesn't apply to those who have been tested 5 days after they returned and they get a negative test, or Slack employees. However, the newest rule is if you return from travel on or after November 30th and you work at a Stanford location in Santa Clara, then you need to quarantine for 14 days, even if you take a test and even if you're a Slack employee. The only exceptions are healthcare workers and first responders. The next step is to look for the parts of the rule that need to be turned into questions and phrase them so that they can be answered with a true or false. For example, did you return on or after November 30th? Are you a healthcare worker? Are you a first responder? Have you been tested 5 days after you returned? Are you a Slack employee or do you work in Santa Clara County? All these can be answered with a simple true or false. The next step is to turn all these into emojis. Well, that's optional, but it makes it more fun. And this is the kind of table that we're going to build. You can see that the statements are the headings of the table, and each cell contains either true or false. Each row will be a scenario, and the last column is the result. So if you look at the first row, that's the scenario where everything is true. Travel, the person is visiting Santa Clara County, they've been tested, there are healthcare workers, they're a first responder, and they work at Slack too, which is pretty impressive. And in that case, they're not asked to quarantine because you just can't quarantine Superwoman. Okay, let's see how we build a truth table. You start at the leftmost column and you enter true on one row and false on the next. You then move on to the next column and you double the number of rows. So you're entering 2 rows with true and 2 rows with false. You then move on to the third column and you double the number of rows again. So 4 rows with true and 4 rows with false. And you continue moving to the next column, doubling the number of rows until you get to the last column, which will be completely filled. That would also tell you the total number of rows, which in our case is 64, which happens to be 2 to the power of 6, which is the number of our columns. Now, Google Sheets makes it easy to fill out the rest of the rows, either by dragging the selection down or by double-clicking on the box after you've made the selection. Now, if you build a table this way, you're guaranteed to cover every logical scenario, which is the power of a truth table. Our table now lists all possible scenarios, but it doesn't tell us whether one should quarantine or not based on each scenario. You can see that our very last column is empty. So this is when we go back to the rules to help us assign an outcome to each scenario. In this case, we see that neither rule applies to healthcare workers. They do not have to quarantine because of travel. So we go back to our table, sort it so that all the scenarios where "are you a healthcare worker" is true are at the top, and then we fill in the outcome column with false. So what we're saying here is that no matter what, if it's true that you're a healthcare worker, it's false that you have to stay at home. We then do the same thing with first responders. They're also excluded from the travel quarantine rules. And so when it's true that you're a first responder, it's false that you have to stay home. And so we update the table accordingly. There's 2 exclusions to care of most of the scenarios, But we want to make sure that all scenarios are accounted for, and so we go back to the rules and fill each scenario until the table is complete. If you were to find gaps, this is the time to go back to your subject matter experts and discuss what might be missing. In our case, the rules were covering every scenario, so we could move to the next step. And this is where we build some tests that we can use to make sure the code behaves as expected. And having a truth table makes it incredibly easy, because I can copy and paste the table into a text editor, and with a few substitutions, I can have a list, an array, of all the inputs that will go into my function and the expected output. I can then have my testing suite loop over this list and run every test. And because we built a complete table, I know that every scenario is covered, which is comforting. Well, I hope I've rekindled your appetite for truth tables and shown you how creating one can help document requirements with your stakeholders, ensure there are no missing scenarios, and create a complete set of tests with very little added effort. Now, all things that should help you sleep more soundly. Thank you for your time.